Hello everyone, Ben DeBono here. Talk to you today about question 7 of the Summa. And if you thought things were confusing and dense before, well, buckle your seatbelts, because question 7 is, in my opinion, the most difficult one yet. You've heard my mantra a few times now to focus on key terms and big ideas. Well, I will fully admit there were a couple parts in here where I was reminding myself of the need to take my own advice. But I think I've got a good enough grasp on things to be able to talk about them with you, at least with the first couple articles. So let's just dive in. We'll do the best we can. And as always, just focus on how the main idea here is basic comprehension. We're not trying to understand every last little detail of the Summa. Very complicated book. So we'll just do the best we can, and I'm speaking to myself there as much as to anyone watching. So I filled out some of the rest of the treaties here in Prima parts, so you can kind of see where we're going here over the next many videos up until we finish the first part with question 119. But for now, we're still in the treatise on the one God. Still in the question of how God exists, and we're right smack in the middle of Aquinas' discussion of the divine essence. So, God is wholly simple, God is wholly perfect. And then building on top of that, we see that God is infinite. That becomes part of his perfection. And so, that has two questions. Questions 7 and 8. First question, the infinity of God, and then the existence of God in things we'll talk about next time when we look at the 4 articles in question 8. 4 articles in question 7. Number 1, whether God is infinite. Number 2, can anything but God be essentially infinite, meaning have infinity as part of its essence? And number 3, can any actually infinite magnitude exist, and whether an infinite multitude can exist? And I will fully admit that in those last 2 is where I felt a bit in over my head, but we'll do the best we can. So, whether God is infinite. A few objections here. Aristotle tells us that everything infinite is imperfect, since it has parts and matter. God is perfect, as we've seen in that whole last discussion in questions 4 through 6. Therefore, he's not infinite. Aristotle also says that the finite and infinite have to do with quantity, but since God doesn't have a body, go back to question 3, article 1, quantity isn't applicable to him, and therefore he's not infinite. And then number 3, since there are things God is not, his substance is not infinite. In other words, if God was infinite, he would be everything. But since we've already refuted the pantheistic argument, it seems that he's not infinite, since there are limits on what he is. He isn't you, he isn't me. Those are limits on what God is. So that seems to disprove his infinity. Argument from authority, well, there's lots of verses you could go to, plenty of them from the Church Fathers. Damascene says that God is infinite, eternal, and boundless. Basic Christian belief. Alright, argument here. Infinity is classically attributed to the first principle, which we've already proven that God is. So, starting out, Aquinas, he's not really proving anything with his first statement that he starts out the argument with. He's just trying to remind us that, hey, all the classical philosophers are pretty much in agreement on the fact that the first principle, whatever that is, whether we call it God or something else, is infinite. Okay, now we move into the actual proof itself. Form and matter make each other finite. Matter limits form, and form limits matter. Without form, matter would be, and that would be what Aquinas is kind of referring to as prime matter. It would be fully potential, be pure potential, so it would be infinite but imperfect. Well, that obviously can't apply to God for many reasons. We know he's perfect, we know he doesn't have matter. But form without matter is infinite and perfect, at least within its substance or species. I say that because there does need to be a distinction between God, who is form without matter and is beyond every genus, every species, and the angels, who would be form without matter, who would be infinite and perfect within their species, but not perfect in the way that God is perfect. Okay, so form without matter is infinite and perfect. God is being itself. Saw that. Question 3, Article 4. And being itself is the most formal of all things. It has its pure form. Question 4, Article 1. Then God is pure form, perfect, and infinite. Okay, so what's that saying? Well, because God is being itself. He is existence. His existence is his essence. And existence itself, being itself, is the form that stands behind every other form. Just as God stands behind every other genus. Therefore, this applies, the second clause right here, that form without matter is infinite and perfect and outside of every genus, and so therefore God is pure form, perfect and infinite. And then I included this note here that other forms besides subsistent being are not infinite since they are always received form limited by matter. In other words, what I'm trying to point out here with this note is that you could make the argument, well, okay, so God's a perfect being, but what about, since he's form without matter, but what if we just look at like the form of humanity in its abstract version without any reference to an individual human? Couldn't we say that that's kind of, we're saying the same thing about God as we would say about that? And the answer to that would be no, because God really exists outside of matter, whereas we can speak about the form of humanity, but the form of humanity is always a received form. It always exists in in something that has received it, and that's the distinction between Aristotelian metaphysics and Platonic metaphysics. Okay. Objections answered. Reply to 1. Aquinas states that this has been answered in the argument. I gotta say I didn't quite see how, but we'll go with it. Reply to 2. Infinity in terms of quantity refers to infinity of matter, which does not apply to God. So Aristotle's talking about something that would be material and infinite. And reply to number 3. Pure act and being is distinct from the finite, since everything that makes something finite is a limiting of participated existence. So I think that what this is trying to say is that we're looking at it wrong if we say that God is limited by not being everything. Rather, it's everything that is limited by not being God. God is the infinite. We participate in that, and we have those limitations. So God is not us, but we're not a boundary to his infinity as a result of him being pure act and experiencing none of the limitations that we do. Not sure I 100% grasp that, but that is as close as I got, at least for the moment. Alright, Article 2. Can anything but God be essentially infinite? Probably not. Well, let's see what we have to say. Okay, since God is infinite, his power is infinite, and he could create something else essentially infinite. Alright, this is just kind of a classical, if you've ever heard, could God make a rock so big he couldn't pick it up? Or the Homer Simpson version, could God make a burrito so hot he couldn't bite into it? So this is kind of the classical paradox that we're going to deal with there. A nice, fun mind-bender question, but as we'll see, a fairly meaningless one. Number 2, the created intellect is infinite, since it apprehends the universal. And then primary matter is infinite. Argument from authority. Aristotle tells us that the infinite cannot have a beginning, and that's going to rule out, ladies and gentlemen, everything except God. So that pretty much kills that argument. But what you're going to see here, though, throughout this article, and this is important, is that Aquinas is going to say there are things that are relatively infinite, but not absolutely infinite. We've talked about how Aquinas a lot of times parses his terms. Now we're drawing a distinction between the type of infinity that can exist in things and the type of infinity that belongs to God alone. Okay? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I probably just did. So other things can be relatively infinite according to their potential. A piece of wood is finite, but it has infinite potential. You can take a piece of wood and there's literally no limit to the amount of different shapes you can carve it in. Or if there is a limit, it's so astronomically high that it's beyond our comprehension. And then self-subsisting forms without matter, such as angels, are also relatively infinite, since they lack matter. However, they have a beginning, so they are not absolutely infinite. So, important distinction here. Relative infinity is something that we perceive as being infinite, has no material limit, you might say, but still has a beginning. Absolute infinity is something that has no material boundary attached to it and also lacks a beginning. And that's God alone. Okay? By definition, that can only be God, since he is the first principle. All right, objections answered. It is against a made thing to be absolutely infinite, since it has a beginning by definition. In other words, the definition of a created thing is that it must have a beginning. It's nonsense to talk about something not having a beginning and being having a beginning and being absolutely infinite. It's just a contradiction in terms. God cannot make contradictions. And I included this quote that I love from C.S. Lewis here in The Problem of Pain, that I think just cuts to the heart of this, where he says, "It remains true that all things are possible with God. The intrinsic impossibilities are not things but non-entities. It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives. Not because his power meets an obstacle," and this is the quote I love, "but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk about God. God can't make black white. We can call black white, we can change the label, but it still is what he is, what it is. God can't make 5 stones 10 stones. He could make 5 additional stones, he could multiply them, but you can't have 5 stones and then all of a sudden that's really 10 stones because God can do anything he wants. You get the idea. It's nonsense. So if we're dealing with logical impossibilities, not just things where it's like, how could Jesus come back from the dead, because dead bodies don't do that, but where in a case like that we would say God is operating on a logic greater than our logic, greater than observed logic. But no, here we're just talking about when we get to the nature of something, what it is. It's nonsense, even if we're saying God can do it. Anyway, enough about that. I just find that an interesting thought. The intellect is relatively infinite in the way that the angels are. In other words, going back to objection 2, the intellect does not have a material boundary, but it does have a beginning. And then primary matter is not self-subsisting. It is made infinite as it extends only... It is made finite, I should have written there, as it extends only to natural forms. In other words, so primary matter, even if we were to say that doesn't have a beginning and we posit that hypothetically, we would say that, well, it's still limited because it only can deal with natural forms. It only can deal with the material. So by definition, it is limitation. Right, because we've looked at how material is what causes something to be finite. All right, here we go. Whether an actually infinite magnitude can exist. So magnitude is the extent of a single thing, like how much there is of something. Multitude is many things. So can there be, so in this first one we're going to ask, can anything extend its properties infinitely, like air, fire, all that good stuff, or can, and then in the next one we'll ask, can there be an infinite number of anything? Our objections. Mathematics uses infinite magnitude and there is no error in mathematics. It is not against the nature of magnitude for a magnitude to be infinite. Therefore, it is possible that an infinite magnitude exists. In other words, there's really, when we think about the magnitude of something, there's no reason why magnitude in and of itself must be finite. Magnitude is infinitely divisible. You can, it's kind of like the stupid line, the stupid self-help line that if you only ever go halfway, you'll never get there. Which I guess is technically true. I mean, you get very, very close, but you kind of see what they're saying. Like if you have something that's 6 feet long, you chop it in half. It's 3 feet, you chop it in half, you chop it in half, you chop it in half, and all of a sudden, eventually you're splitting atoms. But if you could still theoretically chop that in half, it's infinitely divisible. Since division is the contrary of addition, something can also be added to it infinitely. Okay? Movement and time are derived partially from magnitude. It is possible for both of these to be infinite. Therefore, the same is true of magnitude. Authority says all bodies are finite. That doesn't just mean human bodies, but it means any thing, any material thing is finite. Therefore, magnitude must be finite. Why? Because magnitude has to do with a body, So I can be infinitely white. My whiteness as a quality there's nothing to do with the quality of whiteness that would require it to be finite. But I could only be finite whiteness because I have a finite body, and we extend that principle to everything else. All right, argument. Things like fire and air have infinite magnitude, but their interaction with matter limits them. That's essentially what I was just trying to say, but Aquinas, of course, says it better. All actual bodies are made finite as a result of having matter and form. So since magnitude has to deal with the material world, even though there's nothing in its nature that would require it to be finite, in dealing with matter, it becomes finite. So I think we're okay there. Aquinas does say quite a bit more. I just tried to pull out the big ideas there because, this is where it was going over my head. A reply to 1. In mathematics, infinite is a label applied to a finite line. So in other words, what objection 1 was talking about is like, you're sitting in math class and the teacher draws a line on the chalkboard and says, this line is it's infinite length, for the sake of doing a mathematical calculation. Well, Aquinas is saying that, okay, within the logical world of mathematics, you can say it's infinite, but really that line that we're calling infinite is a finite line. It exists on the chalkboard, which is a finite chalkboard. Reply to 2. Infinite is not against the nature of magnitude, but it is against the nature of any species with magnitude. It's kind of what we were seeing up here. It's not against the nature of whiteness to have an infinite magnitude, but it is against the nature of Ben di Bono to have infinite magnitude of any quality that Ben di Bono has. And so the same applies to any natural body. All right, a thing can be infinitely divisible, but it does not follow that it can be infinitely added to. Even if a body had that potential, it would be impossible for that potential to be actualized. And I think that the reason for that is still building on this essential idea that material there is a limit. There is a material, when you're dealing with material things, there is a limit. Is there more to what he's saying than that? Probably. That's what I got out of it. Okay? Movement and time are not actual, but they are potential mixed with the actual, therefore saying that they are infinite. So what he's saying there is that, like, take movement. There are an infinite number of potential movements that you or I could make. But that's not an actual thing. It's potency mixed with actual, so we can't actually... So because those things are derived from magnitude, doesn't actually prove that magnitude is actually infinite. It proves that any magnitude with time and movement might have the potential for infinity. It has infinite potential, but infinite potential can't be actualized simultaneously. And I think we're going to get into more of that as we move into this next question, whether an infinite multitude can exist. Objections. Number 1, number can be multiplied to infinity. Therefore, an infinite multitude could exist. It's always possible to add one more to whatever number you're talking about. Okay. Any individual or species can be made actual, or any individual of any species can be made actual. The species of figures is infinite. Therefore, an infinite number of actual figures is possible. So, to put this in terms that I can understand, let's take the species of human. There is an infinite number of possible human beings. Any one of those can be actualized. Therefore, it's possible for an infinite number of human beings to exist. Okay? I think we got that. All right, number 3. It is possible for an infinite number of unopposed things to exist, since unopposed things don't obstruct each other. So as long as two things don't prevent each other's existence, it's possible for an infinite number of one or both of those things to exist. All right, Wisdom 11:21 is going to tell us that God has given everything measure, number, and weight, which precludes the idea of an infinite multitude. Argument. Every multitude must belong to a species of multitude. Every species of multitude is measured by number. Any number is finite since it is measured by 1. Therefore, every multitude is finite. That's where I got stuck. Every multitude must belong to a species of multitude. Okay, so I got that. So so let's see if we can work this out. Every multitude, say we have a multitude of human beings. They belong to the species of human beings. So human beings are measured by number, and any number is finite because it can be measured by 1. Therefore, every multitude is finite because it can always be measured. So since it can always be measured, even if there's infinite potential, its actualization is always finite. I think we got it. Okay, let me say that one more time. So any multitude is a number, and that number is measurable. It's not just infinity, it's a real number, divisible by 1. Therefore, that multitude is always finite. Now, to go back to our example of human beings, there's infinite potential for every possible human being to exist, and the potential of human beings existing is infinite, but at any given time, that number is finite since it's divisible by 1 and measurable. I think that's as close as I'm going to get, and I think we've got the big idea. I mean, if we're going to go for the really big idea, there's no such thing as an infinite multitude there, If nothing else, we get that. Okay, let's see about the objections. Even if a multitude is potentially infinite, the multitude is actualized successively, making it finite. Okay, I think this is kind of what we're talking about, that there are potentially unlimited number of human beings, but and because any given potential human being could be actualized, the number of potential human beings is infinite, but they would never be actualized simultaneously. They are actualized successfully through generation and whatnot. Therefore, that number is always finite as it exists in the real world. Okay, and then same type of thing here. Simultaneous actualization prevents any, for what we're talking about there. And then infinite number is opposed to any single multitude. Therefore, an infinite number cannot exist. I think that goes back to the main argument where, two unopposed things, two things opposed can't coexist. Let's see what it says. It is possible for an infinite number of unopposed things to exist, since unopposed things don't obstruct each other, don't prevent each other's existence. But, as we saw in the argument, infinite number is opposed to any multitude because any multitude has a finite number. Therefore, objection 3 is done. Okay. I think I've got it, actually. I don't know how well I'm expressing it for you, but I think I've got at least the big ideas here of what he's talking about. I hope you do too. I know this is confusing stuff. Again, let's focus on the big ideas. So I just want to, I haven't usually done this, but because in my opinion anyway, this is kind of a confusing question. Let's just very briefly here at the end, and I promise that I'll wrap up. Just to recap this. God is infinite, okay? It's part of God's character that he is infinite. He has no boundaries. He has no beginning and is not limited by matter. Okay. Nothing else does that apply. Even for things not limited by matter, such as the intellect or angels, they all have a beginning, therefore nothing else is infinite, absolutely as God is infinite. There's no quality that can, whether it be whiteness or fire or air, that can extend its magnitude to infinity because it's limited by matter. And there is no such thing as an infinite multitude because of the problem of simultaneous actualization. Any multitude is successively actualized. So even if we were dealing with infinite potential of a multitude, that multitude is not going to exist infinitely at the same time. It can always be measured, which makes it finite. So to wrap up, God is infinite, and nothing else can ever be infinite in the way that God is infinite. I think that's a fine note to end on. So that's it, everyone. I hope you're doing okay with grasping these ideas. I know they're tough, but we'll get there slowly but surely. Next time, question 8, which is, again, 4 articles. So we'll cover that in one video. And I'll be back in a couple days with that video. I'll talk to you then. Goodbye.